What we're going to do now is transition to our panel, and I'd like to introduce Professor Tony LaMontagne, who I don't even know how many years we go back, Tony, but at the time, Tony was here in Colorado doing some very interesting worker health and safety issues. And now he leads the Work, Health, and Wellbeing Unit and directs the Center for Population Health Research at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. His broad research interest is in developing scientific and public understanding of work as a social determinant of health, which, by the way, that's the phrase, that's the jargon that I use to reach public health students, is to have them understand that work is an important social determinant of health. And translating this research into policy and practice to improve workplace and worker health. Currently, his unit primarily focuses on work and mental health, combining a range of etiologic and intervention research projects. So help me welcome Tony, and Tony, I'll have you introduce the panel or have the panelists come up and take it from here. So help me welcome Dr. LaMontagne.
Thanks very much, Lee, and good afternoon, everyone. This person over here needs no introduction. First one ticked off, so I'm just going to introduce people in turn, and please come up after I introduce you. Our first panelist is Heidi Hudson from CDC NIOSH, and Heidi leads the team for research translation and communications for the Office of Total Worker Health at NIOSH. Next, I'd like to welcome David Parker from the University of Minnesota. Over the last 25 years, David's been developing large-scale intervention studies. What's that? Oh, gosh, I got the wrong institute. Nicollet Institute. Apologies, David. Apologies. David's been leading large-scale intervention studies in small enterprises in the manufacturing and service sectors. Next, I'd like to welcome Anka Bejan. Anka's an industrial hygienist working for the Health Partners Institute in Minneapolis. And she's currently managing a technical education curricula and health and safety study, and has also been involved for a number of years in a collision auto repair study that was funded by NIOSH. Finally, we have Garrett Burnett, also from NIOSH. And Garrett is a research to practice specialist and the assistant coordinator for NIOSH's Small Business Assistance Program. Great. All right, so welcome everybody. And turn to our questions. And there will be time for you all, jot your questions as you go along. There'll be time for you to add questions to the panel yourselves. So let's try to start on the positive. So can some of you please give us some examples of health and safety research or evidence being adopted into practice by small businesses? Some success stories.
Well, from a technological viewpoint, I think that we've seen huge changes in workplace safety with regard to things like machining. Mm-hmm. Whether or not, that was influenced by research that those around the table, meaning the group here, have done, or mm-hmm. a combination of things. Mm-hmm. But I think that there's been large changes in manufacturing processes that have along the line of automation that have removed hazards. Yeah. And good. Look at the amputations, say, in 1995 versus now, we've gone from 18,000 a year to 4,000 to 5,000 a year. So there's been a several-fold decrease. And a lot of that, I think, though it's unknown, is secondary to engineering changes that have mm-hmm. removed old and outdated equipment. Engineering out the hazard. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Thanks. Heidi, please add more.
Yes. So I can talk from a total worker health perspective. For the total worker health program, we have our centers of excellence, and we have several examples in terms of how they are bringing visibility to the concept of total worker health to their communities. And they're working with several organizations, such as workers' compensation firms, as well as national safety councils in their regions, and and they've been successful in bringing promising practices to this emerging field of research and practice. And I'll give some examples. One is an example that was recently formed in the state of Oregon. SAFE Corporation, which is a workers' compensation firm in Oregon, and the Oregon OSHA, as well as the university that's one of our centers is housed in, they formed an alliance, and this alliance is geared to provide expertise and education to employers in their region. Another is that, well, all of our centers of excellence have pilot studies, and I know from the example of Iowa, the Nebraska Safety Council applied for a pilot study, and their pilot study was geared to help organizations in their small businesses in their safety council to apply total worker health concepts. So those are two examples in
Great.
how our centers are working with intermediaries.
Fantastic. Thanks. Using networks and all. Anka, anything from collision repair in that 7-year study that you could comment on?
I would second what David was talking about in terms of engineering controls becoming more available and more mainstream. And a great part of that is due to the manufacturers really understanding more about the effectiveness of the equipment they design and adopting different design practices and then marketing that successfully to small businesses such as collision shops that must have a paint booth. And so they just have better paint booths with downdraft ventilation, whereas before that wasn't always available.
So that's the isocyanate story, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes,
Those
and
of us health
also
and
I
safety
think
people
it's important to acknowledge the financial incentives that in some instances, especially in small businesses, are tied to some of the adoption of these engineering controls, whereas a paint booth manufacturing company would have an incentive for a business to purchase a specific model from them by giving them a specific percent off. And so do paint companies that manufacture their products to these businesses. So having that financial incentives makes it easier in a way for a shop owner to decide to adopt a specific material to work with that often comes with some training on the technical aspect of the system of paints as well as work practices.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it is nice. It's sort of echoing John's talk.
Can I add
where marketing actually goes in the direction of improving worker health.
And correct me if I just want to add a little point to what Anka's saying. So a paint booth, say, is $100,000. So a manufacturer will come into a small collision shop and say, okay, we'll give you a paint booth, correct? But you have to buy PPG paint, or you have to buy whatever paint for the next 5 years. So they'll kind of arrange a deal. And I suppose in some respects it's both sides win. They get to sell their paint, which, collision paint is really expensive stuff. But the shop gets to get a new paint booth that is going to, in all likelihood, be designed correctly with downdraft instead of horizontal and that sort of thing. Does I get that correct?
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks. Garrett, something you want to
add?
Yeah,
within kind of our work in small businesses at NIOSH, some of these kind of positive effects, you can see changes in technologies, changes in practices and process. And one thing that we've been pleased to note is in kind of doing some interviews and in our studies, finding that there's a nice cultural shift that's occurring, and this is a really positive thing because you speak to, or I guess a week ago, I was speaking to a carpenter and asking, what do you think are the most dangerous things that you need to be worried about occupationally? And he said, well, of course there's the power tools, but we've got basically the guards, the technologies that we're not all that worried about those. We know how to use them. We're very, very careful, and I'm worried about dust inhalation, and it was one of many experiences where I'm thinking back, maybe a generation of carpenters ago, and that's not the thing that would have been on their mind. Something that was a long-term health effect, something that was not immediate was. And so this is a really positive thing to see that more small business owners are finding that it's not part of the job to lose a finger, or it's just not acceptable, right? And that's a big cultural shift, and that's a big win for occupational safety.
Oh, excellent. Thanks, Garrett. Yeah, it is important to take a bit of a historical view, even looking back a decade, because there has been substantial progress. Excellent. All right, on to our next question. So we've heard a lot about barriers to achieving health and safety in small business. So let's revisit some of those, but also facilitators to small business adopting evidence-based practice, whether it's, research, evidence, information, what are the strategies for overcoming some of the barriers, or maybe some examples of facilitators that, in your experience, has helped with improving adoption of better, safer practices?
I'd like to speak about my experience with working with collision repair shops in Minnesota. And that has been the CARS study, for those of you who have seen some of our publications.
Nice acronym. CARS study.
David and Lisa came up with that. What we have found that worked in the beginning was to work together with a trade association that was representing the collision repair businesses in the state. However, as the study progressed, it became very clear that they weren't equipped to be taking on the mission of health and safety. And even though we were able to publish a number of articles about the study's success in their association newsletter, we really had trouble finding support from the trade organization to continue even supporting a web-based form of making the materials available to their constituents. So we had created things like respirator program templates and worker training, things that all business owners were supposed to do as part of their OSHA compliance efforts. And surprisingly, we found a lot less interest than we expected. So to us, that was a barrier and a challenge. And as a result, those materials are still doing very well in our own closet with a copy to NIOSH, which I think is regrettable.
Yeah, that is regrettable. Peter's rocking a hard place from this morning's talk. There's a very concrete example. Yeah.
Well,
Garrett or David, yeah? Please.
Just kind of continuing, I think in terms of facilitators, I think, again, reiterating what Anka has said, is trade groups can be really helpful. But I also say, and it also concurs, is that they're very limited for the most part. And an example of the helpful is I've done, up until recently, I did almost all the recruiting minus a couple businesses for all of our studies. And so it's like hundreds of businesses that I've recruited. Yeah. And it's a huge effort. And having the trade groups help with that sort of thing can be invaluable. And in particular, CARS stands for Collision Auto Repair Safety Study, CARS, 2 S's. So the Alliance of Automotive Service Providers was enormously helpful in getting businesses to participate. I'd say, oh, well, Judel said I should, call you and that you would participate. Okay, Judel told you to call. We'll do it.
Yeah.
And sometimes even that name, they say, well, we don't want to finish the study. I say, well, what do you mean you don't want to finish the study? Of course you're going to finish the study. We recruited you, we came in, we gave you the materials, we need the data. I say, well, I said, no, you're going to finish the study. We actually have a very good finishing rate, too. We're like over 90, 95% completion for these things. And again, I think that sometimes you're saying, well, Judel will be mad at you or something like that. It's really helpful. But again, reiterating, but now with the precision metal manufacturing and our national study on machine guarding, actually the trade groups played virtually no role. Yeah. And in fact, I would say that this is sort of, in a way, was a barrier because they really were fighting some of the issues on lockout and tagout and saying, well, OSHA's overreaching with regard to lockout and tagout. I say, well, look, lockout is 14% of manufacturing fatalities. How can you say that this isn't a relevant issue? Well, we think they're overreaching. We're not going to support this. Yeah. So it isn't a one-way thing here for the trade groups. Sometimes they're wonderful, especially at a local level. But nationally, they also have an agenda that doesn't necessarily align. Yeah. And then, OSHA's been in, it's fining our members. We don't agree with that, and we're fighting those fines.
So it's a matter, in a sense, of knowing the context of, and every small business context will vary, and what the players are who might be supportive or might be resistant.
And also the small business associations, the collision, the machine, the woodworking associations, the membership varies from year to year. So one year you may have a member that's very supportive, and
Yeah.
another year you may not. You know, we Lisa Brasso and I did a study on woodworking and dust control. And we thought, oh my gosh, you know, we've got really good support, some of our advisory board, and then one of the members of our advisory board builds a new business, and after Lisa and I have spent these 2 years talking to him about ventilation, he builds a new business. He doesn't ever bring up the issue of ventilation to us, never asks a word about it.
Ouch.
You know, you don't
Frustrating.
know.
Yeah, yeah. We have to take our wins and our losses. Garrett, please.
Something interesting for us, you know, we find, of course, that intermediaries, they're so important. And in talking to people, you just say, okay, what's the biggest thing that would influence you, or how would you find information, you know, that type of thing, and say, oh, well, our trusted source, you know, you know, it's a supplier where we buy our materials, or it's, you know, part of our, you know, basically our peer networks, right? And one of the problems with small businesses, of course, is that they're isolated and they have a pretty limited peer network. And so one thing that we've been stumbling across recently is asking, you know, okay, so if you encounter a problem, where do you go to find that information? And universally, the answer is the internet. We go to the Google or YouTube, right? And this is one of these things for us that it's, you know, it's a wonderful leveling of the playing field. You know, in our case, we're this national agency. There's one of us, and there's 1 million small businesses. There's no way we can reach them all. However, smart use of the internet kind of flattens everything a little bit, and of course, the caveat there is we can't, in trying to reach these small businesses, say, oh, well, they're probably going to go to Google and type in, how can NIOSH help me be safer with my whatever,
If
right?
only, yeah.
And so our challenge becomes, how do we use this tool that has become in itself an intermediary?
Yeah.
How do we package what we're saying in something that they'll actually search for, that they'll actually care about? And so, you know, that for us, that's kind of this next level of investigation, you know, how we use that tool
Fantastic.
in an appropriate way.
Yeah, it's right along the line with
I
John's
think I'm
talk.
hearing a
Yeah.
Disney NIOSH.
Disney NIOSH, yes.
But what occurs to me, and what occurs to me as well, again, it's in this idea of you're probably steps away from this in your university. There's a great deal of research that's been done on. Some of you may have noticed a guy named Dick Thaler won the Nobel Prize in Economics this year, and he wouldn't know me if you mentioned me to him, but I knew him when he was at Cornell. And the reason he won it is because of the deep study he and others have done about the irrationality and how humans process. So they won't go to NIOSH, as rational as that would be, but they will go to an internet celebrity, and if they talk about it, they'll believe them. Well, it turns out that there's a great deal of research on that. Dick wrote a book called Nudge, which is about how little it takes to get someone to change their focus, to get someone to adopt something. And it's very interesting, very consistent things like if I frame it as a loss, you're going to feel it's much more important to you than if I frame it as a gain.
Yeah.
If I make it vivid, you'll be much more likely to act on it than if I don't. Some things that we do instinctively, but there's also a lot of research on now social media and what causes something to go viral and who becomes an internet celebrity and that kind of thing. So I would just say in this realm, there may be more out there in cognitive psychology, behavioral economics to be drawn on to sort of nudge folks in this direction.
Oh, excellent. Good addition. Yeah, we're constantly reminded how multidisciplinary the problems are that we face. Heidi, please.
Yeah, thank you. And another perspective is, I think this was mentioned earlier in Glorian's talk, just the importance of leadership. So being able to find a pro-health entrepreneur or leader within the community, that's going to really facilitate or drive that change. And they, you know, because they want to be the employer of choice. They have a reputation that they're trying to protect. They're at the football games, they're at church, they're within the community, and they care about their community. So they I think that really is a rich avenue to explore, just finding those people that could really advocate for this pro-health, that, you know, they know the barriers, they know it's going to take a long time to implement these programs into their workplace, but they also recognize how valuable it is, not only because, you know, they run their businesses like a family. I mean, their employees are very personal to them, and they care, you know, about what they're doing. So that's just one add.
Yeah, thank you.
So I have to comment on Disney and safety, right? Monsters, Inc., like one of the great animations, Pixar. It might have been pre-Disney, though, the Monsters, Inc. I don't know if Disney had acquired them at that point. So at the end of Monsters, Inc., if you watch the outtake, they have this thing, they show all these things on the safety rules for the monsters. And it is the funniest thing you've ever seen.
Yeah.
So if you have never seen the outtakes on Monsters, Inc., go back and have a look at the outtakes, and you'll see all these safety rules listed one by one, and it's really hysterical.
Oh, that's good. Thank you for that.
I just have to tell you, Lee, this like made my whole visit, so this one I'm taking away with me. Yeah, go.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. That's great. We're connecting the talks here quite effectively. All right, so on to another question. Now, Garrett, you've already anticipated this with your answer to the last one, but maybe others could chime in on it. How do small business owners, managers seek evidence or solutions to problems that they're facing? Where do they go? Who do they go to? When do they go? And we've already had a start on this discussion from Garrett, great anticipation, but maybe others could add some more to that.
Well, sales representatives are a big one, and if
Yes.
it's a sales representative that knows something, you're kind of lucky. But, you know, typically the sales personnel are representing the products that they have. So if it's a good product, well, then they get a good product. But if they're looking for safety gloves, Anka can tell you all sorts of things about gloves. You know, they're selling them gloves that don't serve the task because they don't understand what gloves are. And if it's a 3M representative, then, you know, they're probably selling them a good product, but maybe they're selling them a 3M product. If it's a respirator, it's probably the right one. So sales personnel would sit right up there. Now, a lot of the time we want to say, well, the insurance representatives, well, the insurance represented people are very mixed, and sometimes they're well-trained, and sometimes they're not trained at all. We've trained dozens, probably about 60 or 70 insurance, even more, 80 or 90 insurance folks over the last few years as part of our work. And I would say a large percentage of them really had very little background in terms of the types of hazards that they were facing. And in fact, what they were really doing is going out and looking at catastrophic risk and not looking at the work hazards. So they, okay, what's going to make this building blow up? Why is this building going to burn down? And they want to insure against the things that's going to cost them $10 million. But when it came to looking at machining hazards, they really didn't understand what they were looking at. When it came to looking at hazards in a small collision shop, they didn't understand the types of things that they were looking at. In addition, the types of risks and the, I want of another word, algorithms that they use really haven't been vetted and assessed. And a lot of businesses, or many, what a lot means, I don't know, will hire safety consultants. And again, it's no offense to people in Denver, but it's kind of the Wild West out there. I mean, some safety consultants are wonderful. I mean, they're knowledgeable, they do a really good job, and others can we say, you know, go into a shop and say, you have a respiratory protection program, and say, oh yeah, and there's a volume, it's about this fat, and it's got about half as much dust on top of it for the respiratory protection program. So it's just being sold something so that somebody walks in the shop and says, well, let me see your program, they can say, here's our program. And they're not buying anything, it's pig in a poke.
Others, comments on that?
I'll just add, as far as sources of information, in my conversations with collision shop owners, as well as vocational college instructors, they tend to turn to their peers for advice. So if I'm a shop owner and I'm facing a specific problem, first of all, I'm going to ask you only when I have a problem, which is already of some concern, but then I will be asking you, and you may be another collision shop owner that knows just as much about it. So then you end up turning to your network that, let's say it's maybe 10 people and none of them knows the answer, and then maybe I will go to Judell, who in our case was the leader of the local trade organization, who is an HR person and the policy person. And she may not know, but maybe she has a connection with a safety consultant. So sometimes the path to finding information that is useful to a small business owner could be very tedious, and often it happens, or this quest is set off by an incident that already comes to a cost as a business. To add a little bit to what David was saying is, as part of our study, we encountered shops that had been previously inspected by either their insurance company or by the fire inspector that received high grades on how they were doing. Yet when we went in and did a comprehensive health and safety inspection, we found many problems. And so the owner now was confused.
Yeah.
Why didn't the fire inspector tell me about that? Well, a simple reason is because the OSHA fire safety regulations are different from the fire code enforced. And so in an owner's mind, there is little distinction between what fields are mastered by whom, as well as what rules enforced by whom, and to what extent they're different. So I think in that way, probably helping owners understand these differences and educating them would go a long way if we're able to find an effective way to do so.
Yeah, and helping them navigate the rules. It's sort of like the proverbial teachable moment, isn't it? If you can figure out when they're going to need the information, where they're going to go, who they're going to go to, and we can be there, that's when we'll probably get our message through most effectively. Garrett, please.
So the question of, kind of where do they go, and the question of who can actually provide them with information, sometimes there's the disconnect there. In talking with some folks, you say, okay, well, where do you go for, information on something? And they respond, well, I find like an old timer. Someone who looks like they know the ropes, and it's like, oh, they look like they know the ropes, and so is that person, if, say, me as an initiator, if I find that person that people are kind of turning to, are they even interested in promoting safety? And so sometimes you may kind of have to seek out your second choice because that person is maybe not the spot. But another kind of tangential finding there was that so I was talking to one guy and said, hey, tell me about kind of safety, whatever your safety attitudes, right? And he said, I had noted that he had responded very well to some of our fatality reports. We published these, and I shared this with him, and he had really engaged with this. And this is a behavior that we've seen over and over, that a lot of skilled workers, they know their trade, whatever, they respond really quite empathetically to our fatality reports. And so in response to this, he says, well, this is the type of thing that we BS about. We talk about this during our breaks or whatever. We say, oh, did you hear the stupid thing that this guy did? This guy, man, he got his saw, he cut right into a wall without checking for electrical. And so it's those types of things also where maybe it's not a specific person that could be the source of information, but almost can you get other people's stories into kind of the conversation or the narrative, because those get shared. So just maybe kind of another idea that we can work with on that topic.
That's an interesting thing. In some ways, this question of narrative, and in a way, it's really great, but in another way, it has a huge gap. So Anka's been writing curricula for technical colleges, and a lot of the way the teaching goes on is they do it through sort of narrative stories. When they see something, well, then they talk about it. But if they don't see it, well, then it's a lesson that simply goes undiscussed. And of course, if you're not present for the particular lesson or the particular time, then you never catch that particular part of it. So while stories can be really good, on the other hand, they can also fall quite short. And another thing about sort of the old-timer thing, so we're also analyzing some focus groups right now. And one of the interesting things that's come up that I've noticed in the last few days is that some of the technical school faculty are saying, well, We don't teach it because it's the business responsibility. And then when they get into the business anyway, actually a lot of the faculty said that, not some of them, most of them. And then on top of that, they'll say, yeah, but then when they get into the business, that the old timers and the people who are there, they just laugh at them anyway when they bring the stuff up. So even if we teach them the good lessons, they're not going to follow when they get into the business. It's quite a dilemma on this sort of thing about using anecdotes to tell stories as a means of training if it's not embedded. So that's one thing. The second thing is, with regard to small business itself, is that at least the ones we've dealt with, the majority of them don't do any training at all anyway, so it doesn't make any difference. Some of them, the good ones, are going to have a safety meeting, once a month or once every couple of months, or they're going to have a safety committee. But most of them are not even doing that. And so there aren't even these opportunities then to tell stories, because it just doesn't happen. And there's a gap that just needs to push them all right through the door and saying, well, you need to have something, which is one of the reasons that we've really started to push for management employee safety committees. Because it's something you can go in, you can look at, you can assess it really quickly, and you can say, this is how you have to do it, and this is how it works. And it puts a minimum level of responsibility for managing the entire problem that everybody can accept and use together, and it's observable. As an outside person, as a researcher, as a whatever, it's observable. When we did our national study, that's what we did. We said, okay, minimum thing is we're going to go in, we're going to look at safety committee and function, and we're going to go back in, and we're going to be sure that they're doing this right.
I was thinking, it sounds to me like really what we have to have is we have to be nimble, just like small business people. And that range of strategies to use might include stories sometimes. It might be a management labor committee or health and safety committee. But we just have to keep lengthening our list of strategies.
It probably always includes stories. The question is how do you embed stories so that they're always told and everybody hears it? Stories are an intrinsic part of what we do and how we, and public health, quite truthfully, does a pretty crummy job for the most part, the tobacco ads aside, anti-tobacco ads aside. Public health doesn't do a particularly good job with regard to public health messages, especially in the United States. I think our public health ads really stink.
Yeah, we could do better. Yeah.
I'm talking now as a photographer, not as researcher.
Oh, okay. All right. A small business photographer?
No, just like a photographer.
Sorry. Anyway, all right. Did you have something you wanted to add, Heidi?
Yeah, I can add something.
Please.
Sure. Well, we know that the composition of the workforce is changing, and the field of occupational safety and health is broadening. So we do have to have a broader perspective, not only to reach these small business owners, but thinking about how to take the message out and the strategies out to the different people outside of our networks, and inform them, or bring awareness to them, more than just from the perspective of knowledge, but really inform them and get them to understand how work can impact the health of their communities, the health of their workforce, and whether that's talking to chambers of commerce or it's talking to hospital systems. I mean, it's more than just talking to the small business owners and the workers in the small businesses. It could be talking to these worker advocacy programs. So I think we just have to think outside of our own box sometimes, and that in and of itself is a challenge, to be able to figure out how do you talk to people in HR about worker safety and health, and how do you talk to businesses and business schools, and getting people to really understand this impact.
Yeah, John gave us a little simultaneous translation tool there for worker well-being to HR speak.
Yeah.
There we go. That's one thing, we have to become multilingual.
Yeah, well, I think that's right. So I don't know that I have a lot to say about the translation idea, though there's an interesting issue there about that. For example, there are a bunch of entrepreneurs that are trying to crack the code. I call it the Rosetta Stone of work. Like if you have a veteran from the military and you want to move them into the private sector, the way that the military lists work is completely lost on anybody trying. So a squadron commander in the Navy is a terrific fit for a lot of jobs that no one knows about. And it just occurs to me that I can't tell you, I'm probably advising at least 5, maybe more startups that are about, we got to be able to scrape social media. It's like we want you to walk up to some kind of a AI system, and it's going to look at your social media, and it's going to look at your experiences, and it's going to translate that into another AI system that took the work and said, do you fit? And there's something like that about taking all those reports that you've got.
Yeah.
The thing that struck me is there's also a great deal of work going on, particularly by researchers in social media, about social networks and
Yes.
influencers.
Yeah.
And within organizations, to map a social network, I give each of you a piece of paper. If we did it for this room, and it would have the name of everybody in this room on it, and I would have you rate, do you know them? So check that, but also, are they fun to work with? Do you get a lot of information from them? Do you give them a lot of information? If you do that across an organization, there are algorithms that then can create a web where, you're a node and we can see who's connected to you and who they connect to, et cetera. Turns out that when organizations do organizational change now, a number of them, particularly in Silicon Valley, don't do it top down. They don't do it using HR. They don't do it using leadership. At Juniper Networks, the head of HR told me, out of 1,000 employee organization, there were 100 influencers. And they ranged all the way down to the front line and all the way up to the president. We don't convene the executives anymore. We convene the 100 influencers because we know from social network analysis that they're the ones everybody talks to. So and there are some communities that, I'm struck by your thinking about churches and schools and, who's the old timer everybody talks to, and so it's like, if you're hopeless till the old timer gets it, then just, a part of me is just saying, well, then you've got to give that old timer an incentive so that when they talk to people, because everybody, they'd be like this massive node that everybody talks to. And you're not going to get anything done unless they're on board. And it might be an educator or even like a minister. So it's just something to think about is where does everybody go for their information and who do they trust? And a lot of companies do that in communities. They just go right to the spot where everybody talks to someone.
Excellent. Thanks, John. All right, on to another question. Okay, all right. Let's see. Let's skip down to, I think we've covered pretty much all of our questions. I had one about novel strategies for reaching or connecting with small business, which you all have covered pretty well. There was a question about making our work as researchers in small business sustainable, as well as keeping the work you do sustainable in the community. Slightly different. But let's just see if that comes up in question time. So let's move to questions. So please make your way to the microphone and put a question to the panel. Oh, there goes Lee. Yeah.
I'll jump in.
Thanks, Noah.
So I'm trying to connect John's keynote with the discussion of the panel a little bit. And one of the things that strikes me is there's a lot of discussion about influence and motivation and networking and so on. But there's a framework that's missing there, which is our laws and regulations and social policies that set the boundaries for what is and is not acceptable. And if you look at the impact of regulation, it's very profound. It changes behavior in organizations very profoundly. So I think we need to be also thinking about social policies that make healthy work possible, and things like hours and wages of working conditions, secure scheduling concepts, benefits, family leave benefits. These kinds of things are not things that entrepreneurs come up with because another peer organization is doing it or because it seems like the right thing to do. It's because there's a social framework that says certain things are needed in the world of work, and this is what we need. I guess I would add one more, which is retirement and Social Security. How do people get this notion of, John, your notion of work, what is it, work without employment? Where does the Social Security fit into that scheme? And I'm not talking about the high-level programmers who are going to make enough money to sustain themselves in the Bahamas. I'm talking about the shop floor worker who is not going to be able to get there. and is going to create some real social disruption in the future. We need social structures that support these things.
Yeah. It's a nice small question for the panel. Guys, thank you, Noah. No, it's a really important.
Why don't we get
critical.
Lee, why don't you come up and answer that? I mean, I think you've got those total solutions.
Well, I hate to be Davy Downer on that one, but last I talked to a small business owner, they probably could have cared less what I had to say on those things. I agree on regulation, obviously. Probably everybody in the room does.
Yeah.
I mean, we've all been there and supported and probably have at one point or another contacted OSHA because folks wouldn't conform to some reasonable standard. You know, one of the people who worked for me several years ago decided to do a little study. We looked at OSHA-inspected small metal fabrication businesses versus non-OSHA inspected, and we had, roughly our sample had divided 50-50. We actually didn't find any difference between machine safety and OSHA inspected versus non-OSHA inspected. That's simply an aside. But, you know, that being said, the other part of being the downer on the day on your comment is something about the current administration in the next, we hope, only 3 years, does not seem to lend itself to either Social Security, more regulatory enforcement, or social welfare, at least in the United States. Maybe Europe is a little bit better. We can ask our guests from this morning. You know, so I know, and I think I really, obviously, we all agree with you, but I think we're at even more of a loss on these issues of broader social policy and how to move them in. And I think that, but to be more specific, you know, and maybe you have a comment on this. So I've been very interested in this problem of organizational structure in very small enterprises, and so now we're looking at under 100, you know, not like even the 500, but you know, somewhere between 25 and 50 people. Organizational structures seem to change. They bring in personnel, they bring in programs, they bring in policies, but when you're looking at this very small end, that would be the fewer than 25 employees, it becomes even more problematic to try to deal with the within company social policy issues, and then the issue of regulatory enforcement, because they go almost entirely under the enforcement radar, even though they're subjected to it in their own sort of odd ways. So I see you shaking your head, that's why I say their own odd ways. And they don't even want to use OSHA consultation for the reasons we heard about earlier today.
Yeah. Others comment.
I could actually do it if you like. Oh, but go ahead.
I would just like to add a small comment about Noah saying that we have seen firsthand the effects of the type of workplace pay arrangement in collision repair, where workers were often paid by piece or by operation, and that pay scale is dictated by the car insurance companies. And because of that sort of pay arrangement, when it came to for the business owners to have their employees trained to meet the OSHA requirements, everybody's question was, who's paying for this? Because it's not an operation that I can build insurance. There is no other money. So very few, depending on the trade perhaps, businesses have arrangements that are even supportive of implemented some of the regulatory requirements as far as health and safety goes.
Well, Noah's question points in an interesting direction that builds further from John's talk, and I thought you were going to mention this, John.
You mention, this is like, I have a great job. You'll mention it, then I get to say something about it, and everybody will go, boy,
just
John's
put me in the
really-"
book credits, all right?
Yeah, you bet.
But and that is, some have floated the idea of a basic income for everyone. Now, this might come from concerns about the questions that Noah's raised. It might enable the positive aspects of the future of work that you've described to be, you know, more likely than the negative. Or it might be just so people have enough money to buy stuff and we can keep consumer capitalism going. Or maybe it's a mix of all those things. But this is one of the solutions that has been floated. I'm not sure if it's the right one, but does anyone want to comment on that? Since we're getting large, we might as well take on the world.
Yeah, just take on
in our discussion.
the whole notion of economic sustainability. And
Yeah.
so the question is a really good one, and it does open up, when you pull that thread, you end up looking at what society needs to be to empower, you know, as I would call it, this kind of boundaryless approach to work. So I guess I'd have two comments. One is, I think you're absolutely right, and even in Europe, really, I'm not an expert on legislation and public policy, but there really isn't yet a society that has sort of tipped over and put in place the kinds of things it would take to create a robust work system like this one. And Social Security is a piece of it, basic income is a piece of it, but even the Rosetta Stone of work and you know, the nature of how people move between work. I don't have, again, it's just me perhaps, I don't have a lot of confidence and I don't see a lot of evidence that regulation leads thinking. So what I see historically, and I think most people have said that, is that regulation tends to lag. Once industries and the society and others begin to push on the boundaries, then you see it becomes popular enough to legislate, people can see the connection. So I think in a way, I would suspect that the world of work will educate legislators, not the other way around. And again, then I think you come back to looking for where are those places where you can have demonstration projects, where you can show that this not only that this works, but that the people that others want to listen to are doing it. So, you know, you have a lot of examples of that. Again, not so much a downer on the question, but there are a lot of organizations that are trying to be iconic about this stuff. And a lot of CEOs who pride themselves on being seen, at least, and I think some of them very, very legitimately, being seen as being a good employer, being a pioneer in the way we want to do work. You know, you can take Ben and Jerry for two, but Howard Schultz, I think, would pride himself on that kind of thing. So I think there is a place. I'm not sure, again, not to be a downer on the question, I'm very pessimistic that legislation will be the way that'll do it. I think that will lag, but I think what we will need to do is begin to build in debates about this and showcase people that go to things like basic income. Bill Gates has said, let's tax the robots this month, and tax the robots and take the money and put it in a fund, and let's get the people that were displaced by the robots to where they can do something else. And so, you know, there's the robot will pay taxes until that person is stable, basically, that kind of thing. There's a technological association, I was just writing about this yesterday for this new book, that just put out the principles of artificial intelligence, because they're very concerned that one of my videos was, you know, the robots take us all over, and artificial intelligence can now learn from itself. It doesn't even need us to train it anymore. There's a place, you know, they're stepping up and saying we need to get on this early so that there are some principles about that. It's, you know, whenever I come to, and thanks again for Lee for inviting me, whenever I come to conferences like this with people doing this kind of research, it occurs to me that the world needs to know more about what you know. And I think we need to find, I'm thinking industry associations. I was privileged to do a talk at a place called Driving Sales, that is apparently the meeting place for a lot of auto sellers, the people who have those shops and some of those paint shops. They have a lot of influence, and they what they do is they pull out leaders who have treated their workers well in many of the ways we're talking about, and those people say, look at how my profits have gone up. And that's how they influence others, is to say, you want to make the big money that this person makes in Texas? Well, they did it by doing something counterintuitive to you, by paying their workers more, for example.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's certainly true that all regulation aspires to be socially normative, but if there's a different way to get to that social norm that Noah is pointing to, that we'd all like to see, then I'm all for it.
Yeah.
Lee, how are we going on time? Oh, we do have another question. Sorry, you've probably been standing there for a while listening to us.
I actually have an answer to the question, too, if you want.
Please.
So I appreciate you asking it, because it was a question I was going to ask. So I'll just really quickly, I'm Sabrina Freeman. I'm from SAFE, so one of the Total Worker Health Alliance members. And just to say quickly, I actually think legislation is absolutely necessary. It is the lagger. I've worked in tobacco prevention for years. And the idea is that if you can get folks who are innovative and can move the needle up in motivation, you pull the legislation in as the floor underneath. Now those innovators are no longer innovation. They have to go even higher. So I live in Portland, Oregon, where the minimum wage is now $15 an hour. So it's not breakthrough anymore, it's the minimum. So now if you want even better workers, you're gonna have to pay them even more. So it pushes up the floor so that the innovators can continue to move up, and it continues to create that requirement to strive for more. So I think legislation is essential, and the way to do it is to forget the national, go local, go very, very local. It's been incredibly successful. Also, think beyond OSHA. The Clean Indoor Workplace laws are enforced by public health, Minimum wage does not come from OSHA. All those kinds of places. Think beyond just our one standard go-to as the only place to go for those kinds of regulations. So,
Excellent.
sorry.
Great comment. Thank
My
you.
question actually is, having worked in chronic disease for years, you can't get anybody to care about chronic disease because it's not flashy. If the news media showed up on our doorstep, it was about Ebola, which never once killed anyone in Oregon. Never for me is cancer prevention, and cancer is the #1 killer of people in Oregon. So how do we message things so they become more immediate? You talked about platforms for doing it. How do we talk about total worker health and these more long-term exposure, chronic conditions? It could be IH types of exposures, certainly as health exposures, in a way that makes it immediate enough that an employer is going to want to address it, even if they know I've only got this person for 2 weeks. Any thoughts?
Well, I'm keen to hear the answer to this one.
Well, yeah, that's always the ever-present question in all the conferences that I've been to.
No, we got this one solved. Don't worry.
You got it?
No, no, that's something that we're kind of grappling with right now, and looking at very small businesses, 20 or fewer employees. One of the things that we're looking for, what are your top business priorities, right? And we had kind of made the assumption that the cash flow would be the #1 thing, and it turns out that was not correct. That it was customer issues. They were very fixated on these unreasonable customer expectations and scheduling and those types of things, and we also made the assumption that they probably don't care that much about safety, and it turns out that they did. It just wasn't top shelf. And so the approach that we're trying to explore here is to say, okay, how do we take that #1 thing that they care about, those customer issues, and how do we bundle safety and health in there? So we say, okay, in serving your customer, this is how you do it, and by the way, we snuck in some safety and health, right? It's like sprinkling chia seed into your kids' snack cake, something like that. And so, and as far as those very small organizations go, ones that fly under the OSHA radar and that get overlooked by pretty much any regulatory body, for us, I mean that seems like it's kind of the most promising approach to say, okay, what's the thing they really do care about? Because they have so few resources to care about anything other than like the #1 thing. How do we flavor the #1 thing so that it concerns safety and health? And one thing that we have to accept also is that at NIOSH, for every hazard, we have 1,000 things you can do about it. And we're pretty excited about that. And we need to boil it down to like the 2 things you do about it. The one thing, the most important. And so, so we don't have the answer after all, sorry. But that's kind of one approach that we're trying to take at this point.
Right. Thanks. Well, we've got a couple more questioners. So if it's okay with the panelists, we'll go to another question. Please.
Yes, I've been thinking a lot over the years about how to reach employers and how to reach the employer owner. And it seems to me the only way we can reach them is before they are an employer, before they are an owner, when they are students, when they are young people coming through the educational system. Consider a world where every student has been given some exposure to some of the most basic hazards that exist in workplaces. With that information, as they age and mature and become entrepreneurs, they may carry that knowledge into their workplace and the small business that they own. So I see this, maybe it's a generational thing. We are at NIOSH engaged in training programs of this nature, and I think more and more exposure at an early age will eventually affect and impact the employers and owners of small businesses tomorrow.
Oh, thank you. So that's the educational chia seed. There
Yeah.
we go. The educational chia seed that we were talking about. But certainly that is true, and in general education as much as in vocational, I think is what you're implying. Please, Heidi.
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing that up, Vern. So I've kind of thought about this as well, in terms of how do you reach these hard to reach audiences, and a big part of that is just informing of their rights, informing them of their rights, and not only that, but just informing them how work impacts their health. And also what's going on across the country right now with work-family policies. I think that's a good leverage point we can draw upon to really bring that message in that work has this impact among children. It not only doesn't affect them at the workplace whenever they get a job and when they're in their education, but it impacts them in the schools with their parents working, especially when we're in a society with dual earners. So yeah, I think there's an area we can explore, just looking at it from the perspective of these other policies that are happening, in a way to kind of reach these younger workers about the importance of work and health.
Thanks. Okay.
Do I have a
Please.
moment?
Yep.
I would just like to speak about the text projects that David and I are working on right now. There is a poster presented here. It's an effort that we embarked on, which is funded by NIOSH, where we are looking at health and safety education in two-year vocational colleges, not only creating curricula that is now delivered systematically over a two-year program, but also looking at the outcomes of this effort, not only in terms of student knowledge and beliefs and work practices at the end of school, but most importantly at 1 year after graduation, which is the only follow-up period we were able to do in the framework of this study. And we really are trying to look at how can we influence work practices and decisions made at work after graduation through a systematic and comprehensive educational curricula in terms of worker health and safety. And with this, I'd like just a moment to add that some occupations have a lot more, the workers in some trades and some occupations have a lot more control over the work practices they employ and the hazards they face as opposed to others. And we are specifically working with collision repair as well as machine tool technology. And these are two trades in which we see quite significant differences, not only in terms of hazard, but as well as in terms of worker versus employer control over the workplace conditions.
Thanks, Anka. Can we take the final question? Sorry, there was one person patiently waiting with a question, please.
All right, I'll keep it short. This kind of falls at the intersection, I think, of the idea of storytelling, sustainability, and influencers. And it seems to me, a lot of the work we're talking about and doing is how do we design and tailor safety interventions to push down and sell to small business employers and employees. Part of it, though, is I think this idea of sitting around where employees are simply telling stories about stupid mistakes people have made and whatnot is sort of an informal training. And I guess there's an organic cultural concern that develops within the constraints of the small business owner and the employees on how they address safety. And I think one way of looking at it is not only how do we push, design it and move down towards them, but then how do we also document how small business employees and owners actually address safety or are addressing safety currently organically, and how do we emphasize or strengthen and support those organic approaches to safety? They may not be comprehensive or look anything like a safety intervention program that we're used to, but so I was going to ask for some examples, but maybe there might not be time for that.
Emphasizing the way these things happen informally as well as formally. Is that a fair paraphrase of your question? Yeah, so quick comments.
Well, like I said earlier, I'm more and more a believer in the, even if you do it informally, a formal process. I think the failure...
And have it both ways.
Yeah. I think a good story is great because, you got to have a good story. Like, the Autobots and stuff, Optimus Prime taking over or something like that. But they're just not doing the training. I mean, there has to be a starting point in lots and lots of facilities. Where they're doing it, I think employers are often very amenable to change. I think Lisa, Anka, and I mean, we've kind of learned over a period, I don't know, Lisa and I started doing this stuff 30 years ago. I don't know, when did you move to Minnesota, Lisa? Anyway, a really long time ago. We were joking about it on the phone a few weeks ago about all the lessons we've learned about how to approach small businesses and not choosing the wrong thing, and how to get them interested in different types of problems, and still sort of struggling along with it. But you know, you're not going to get someone necessarily to just buy another $1 million, and to Anka's point, you're not going to get someone to just buy another $1 million piece of equipment in their shop unless there's some other gain. The flip side of that is we have a partner, a place called Roberts Automatic, and been there a lot of times to their machine shop, and they had a job that everybody hated. It's like deburring little pieces. So the workers got this old robot, and they enclosed this thing, and it's incredibly safe, and they programmed it. And now this thing deburrs about 10,000 pieces a day, and they love it. The job is completely gone. No one has to do this incredibly tedious job, and completely safe. So there are examples where they just go out and invent their own machines, because these guys are, and it's almost all guys, I mean, they're brilliant at this stuff. So it kind of depends on where you're at. But somebody isn't going to simply buy $1 million machine. They're going to wait till it breaks. But, you know, there are Bridgeports out there that from World War II.
All right. Well, I'm sorry we've run out of time, so we'll need to cap it there. But please join me in thanking all our panelists and John as our speaker.